Hello everyone and welcome to today's event. It's lovely to have you with us here today. My name is Philippa Duthie and I'm the Director of RSA Oceania. Before I begin today, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm broadcasting, the Gubbi Gubbi people and the Turrbal people, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Collectively we stand in footsteps millennia old. Wherever you're joining from today, please join me in acknowledging the elders and traditional custodians of all the places represented here today on the call, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture the land. So welcome everybody and thank you again for joining us for the 6th event in our series, Reclaiming the Future, which is co-hosted by RSA Oceania and the RSA Sustainability Network. In this series, we look at how we can nurture our ability to think long and create a culture of intergenerational and planetary responsibility. Throughout this series, we've been exploring what it means to be good ancestors as individuals and as a society. And the constant message that we've heard from our speakers is that to be good ancestors, we need to think relationally, to see ourselves not as individual actors, but as one link in an interconnected web of humanity, stretching through time and space, supported by the reciprocal relationships we have with the earth and its life-giving systems. This is the vision we need to connect with to create a just, sustainable world for future generations. But as we touched on in the last session, it's hard to think about the future in these terms and to maintain these vital relationships when our most basic needs are not being met in the present. Thinking long-term means tackling the inequalities that exist in our system now. So in this event, we're looking at that other life-giving force around which our lives revolve, money and the economy. Together, we'll explore the nature of value within our systems and look at how we can build circular and regenerative economies that enable people and planet to thrive now and in the future. And joining us to discuss this big topic, we have 3 extraordinary speakers, author, economist and academic, Professor Girol Karacaoglu, corporate sustainability expert, Juhi Shareef, and writer, lecturer and circular design innovator, Chris Ostrich. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome our first speaker for today's event, Professor Girol Karacaoglu. I hope I said that right. Girol is the author of Love You, Public Policy for Intergenerational Wellbeing and head of the School of Government at Victoria University of Wellington. He came to Victoria University from New Zealand Treasury, where he was chief economist. Before then, he was the chief executive of the Cooperative Bank of New Zealand for 9 years. His current research interest is in public policy, an integrated approach to economic, environmental and social policies towards improving intergenerational well-being. So, kia ora, Girol.
Kia ora, everyone. From Aotearoa, New Zealand, hello. Good evening from here. Good morning to most of you. It's delightful to be part of this conversation on the way it's been framed, valuing the long term. I'll share my screen so I can talk to some slides as well. The title refers to an economy for the future. I will reframe the title as far as my presentation goes as an environment for intergenerational well-being, rather than an economy for the future, an environment for intergenerational well-being. And given my primary interest in public policy, I will refer to governing for intergenerational well-being. The objective of public policy in that framing is improving and enhancing well-being, and well-being is about the ability of individuals and communities to live the lives they value. And in that context, the distinctive role of public policy is to create and provide universal access to the environment in which the pursuit of valued lives is possible. I'll operationalize all this, but this is by way of a preamble and setting the scene. By environment in this context, I mean the natural, social, political, and economic environment. And so the economy is absolutely part of it, but just one part of it. And it is this broader environment that defines and constrains the opportunities and capabilities, or as Amartya Sen refers to it, the substantive freedoms for the pursuit of valued lives. In other words, for the pursuit of well-being. In my work, I represent this broader environment in the context and frame it as a well-being garden. The perimeters of that garden, what defines the periphery, the perimeter, the environment, are the key dimensions I referred to. Environmental quality, the potential to create the material comforts such as housing, health, clothing, food that we enjoy. The social environment in which we can live in cohesion across various people, cultures, ethnicities, and so on. And the personal freedoms and political voice that allows us to contribute and participate in shaping the future. If you imagine poles stuck in each of these corners, the one at the top, around which the ribbon is tied, is equity. In other words, access to all these services for everyone. Otherwise, all the other parameters and dimensions of the garden are compromised. I will come back to the significance of the pieces in the middle, which is about resilience, in a few minutes. But imagine those corners as defining or identifying the key ingredients required for people and communities to pursue and live the lives they value, however they want to live their lives, which is a very important point. Before I go into the policy side, which I'm interested in, I make two claims. One of these claims is that this garden, whether you look at it globally or in New Zealand where I live, is shrinking and being distorted. In other words, it's compromising our ability to live sustainably across generations. And in the slides, which I will not go through, but you will have access to, I provide evidence from the OECD and from New Zealand about the facts that support my claim that the garden is shrinking and being distorted. The second claim I make, which is an entry point to my policy conversation, is that we are denying it, or there's a great majority of people who are denying it. And therefore, I refer to a boiling frog syndrome. Unlike the COVID-19, where we all acknowledged that we have a serious crisis that is affecting all our lives, in the case of the distortion and shrinkage of the perimeters of the well-being garden, there's a lot of denial going on. So those empirical facts and the denial I'm referred to set the scene for the policy challenges that we face. The question is, what can we do about it? How can we approach it? And in the context of our small country, what can we learn from the rest of the world as to what can we do about that? I frame the answer to that in terms of what is in the middle of my well-being garden. In other words, the answer to that question, what can we do about it, is we invest appropriately in various facets of resilience, human, environmental, social, economic, democratic, towards expanding the well-being garden. I have two justifications for focusing on resilience building as a bridge between the current and sustainable well-being. One of them is that we are talking across generations and we face radical uncertainty. In other words, we do not know what the future will hold, and we do not know how people will want to live their lives. The second is that we respect the rights of people to live the lives they value, however they choose to do so. So that's one platform for focusing on resilience. The other is the empirical fact that this hockey stick that we are all used to about improving material prosperity over the last 200-300 years relative to the previous thousands of years, the narrative we've been told for many, many decades is that this is due to the Industrial Revolution, technology, and such like. That's only half of the story, and all these claims are supported by the literature I cite. The other side of the story, or half of the story, which relates to resilience, in fact, throughout human history, people have been creative and have done many things to improve their lives. The difference, if you focus on the right-hand corner or side of it, is that in the last 200-300 years, we have created institutions that have protected the downside. So it's not the growth periods, which have been on average more or less the same, but it's the fact that we have created the infrastructure through institutions such as health institutions, education institutions, and economic institutions and such like, to protect us from shocks and to respond creatively to recreating the lives, maybe not the same, but in the ways we want to live them. Those 2 points provide the platform for me in focusing my policy conversation on resilience building across those 5 domains I already referred to. Imagine that you're driving a car and you're going to a particular destination, and the policymaker has the attitude of saying, I don't care where you want to go. I respect your freedom to go wherever you want to go. What I do want to do is to make sure that you travel there safely. 2 things can be done. One is to improve the controls within the car, the wheel, the safety pillows, and whatever else you deal with, cushions, and or to expand the size of the road and put boundaries so that we don't fall off the cliff. The mathematics of this is the viability theory, which is presented on this chart. What we are trying to do is to keep the car within the purple area, and to do that, we are trying to expand and enhance the purple area. And that's the mathematical version of improving resilience. So what can we do and how can we approach that? What kind of interventions can we put in place? When we are facing with radical uncertainty, we respect people's way of living. We cannot anticipate how they will wish to live. We just want to create an environment where they can enjoy their lives. There are several ingredients. I referred to New Zealand, but I will simply use this as an example. Of course, I think this is shared by everyone, and I'll go through this very quickly, just focus on the red parts. The first thing you do is to unanimously agree that intergenerational well-being is the core objective of public policy. In the kind of worlds we live in, that's the role of the governance body, which is Parliament. The second thing you do is to give effect to this commitment and desire by creating an institution it could be a cross-parliament governance group, or better still, it could be a second house of parliament, which is exclusively focused through a representative group of young people and people of various ethnicities and genders to look after and focus on intergenerational governance matters, while the government of the day is doing the governing. The third thing you do is to develop a compelling narrative to convince people that if we do want to enjoy sustained well-being and we want our children to do the same, then we need to look after the well-being garden. The fourth thing is to ensure that every government, whichever political party or persuasion they come from, is held accountable to present and deliver a program that will be aligned with the sustaining the shape and size of the well-being garden. This institution is advised by any independent Office of Well-being on whether the government's program or work is indeed consistent with sustaining well-being. The measurement of the effectiveness, efficiency, and equity of the policy program is not measured by GDP, but by the size and shape of the well-being garden. A commission of some sort in New Zealand is the Infrastructure Commission, acts as the governance group for all major infrastructure projects to make sure that they are aligned with enhancing and improving the well-being garden. And in doing that, it looks at 3 or 4 things. First of all, whether the efficiency and effectiveness conditions are met. Secondly, if we're going to go from A to B, say from fossil fuel to non-fossil fuel ways of transport, that the transition is just and viable. In other words, we don't cross boundaries. That we follow due process, very inclusive process of engaging with communities and all stakeholders in assessing and considering alternatives. That we have appropriate joint private and public funding arrangements, and we have a detailed implementation plan to give effect to all this. When I present this framework to people in New Zealand, often they accuse me of hallucinating. To convince them that I am not, I say to them that, in fact, if you look around the world, there are many countries that are doing various bits and pieces of what I'm talking about. And on this slide, I refer to Wales, Scotland, Finland, Singapore, and on it goes. So there are various bits and pieces of all this being done. The question is, and I think the claim is, no country has embraced the whole program that I'm talking about to make sure that we do it in a systematic way and pursue it. Suppose that we had this governance infrastructure that I'm proposing in place, then how do we prioritize the kind of investments that we need to make? The answer resides on the circumstances of the country you're living in. So it's all context dependent. What we give priority to in our investment decisions and what kind of resilience building that we focus on first will depend on the kind of stresses that your current well-being garden is being under, as well as exploiting the critical interdependencies between these dimensions so that you invest appropriately to benefit from these interdependencies. In the context of New Zealand, the work that I've done shows tentatively, it's very difficult to get good data on these parameters, that if you compare, say, 2005 as a starting point with 2018, the main pressure points on the New Zealand well-being garden have been concentrated on a deteriorating biosphere or environment and deteriorating measures of equity. And the point is, if you don't address these, then all the other issues, such as freedom, as we find in other countries, social cohesion, and economic prosperity will be compromised as well. So the question is, how do we frame and prioritize our investments to prevent that from happening, to reverse those pressures, and to expand the garden. In the context of our policy work, the answer, and then I'll stop, is focused on four main pillars. One is a leave no one behind strategy by making sure, albeit on a means-tested way, to ensure that everyone has access to those basic services I'm referring to, supported by appropriate universal employment strategies, and complemented by an intergenerational investment program to address the intergenerational inequities, especially now, so that there's a taxation system that funds an investment to fund the education and well-being of children when they get to a certain age. The second is a complementary set of strategies to shift and switch production and consumption towards cleaner products. And that can be done through a mixture of policies supported by employment policies that skill people to be able to use and participate in those cleaner technologies. The third is to address one of the major threats to environmental quality and other aspects of the well-being garden, which is to appropriately, through education, not through enforcement, control population, and also through various immigration policies, depending on where you live and what your circumstances are. As Sir Partha Dasgupta in his brilliant biodiversity report published in the UK just highlighted, population growth is one of the major threats to the sustainability of intergenerational well-being and on the biosphere. And finally, you make sure that in prioritizing and deciding which of the various alternatives we can choose in our investments is done in consultation with the communities and stakeholders and business people and scientists to make sure that everybody has a buy-in to what we are talking about so that our shared narrative can be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Girol. And I really hope we can pick up on some of those points in the questions as well, particularly that idea of a compelling shared narrative, which is really, really important, I think. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our second speaker for tonight's event, which is Juhi Shareef. Juhi has over 15 years experience delivering sustainability strategies and supply chain projects. Currently the Chief Responsibility Officer at Tourism Holdings Ltd. She is also the co-founder of Project Moonshot and the Moonshot City Initiative, an exploration into what we need to do to create cities that work for us in the 21st century and beyond. Juhi also spent several years at EcoAge, delivering sustainability strategies and supply chain projects for clients including the Caring Group, Stella McCartney, Wembley Stadium, Marks & Spencer, and the British Film Institute. So, Juhi, welcome.
Kia ora koutou. Just going to start with a traditional introduction, as we would do in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Ko pahar te manga, ko wei te awa, ko chan te iwi, ko Juhi toko ingoa. Hi, everyone. My name is Juhi. Thank you for that introduction, Philippa, and I really enjoyed the talk that we've just had. That was really kind of stimulating, and I've got some questions which I'd love to ask in a little while. I'm just going to share my screen. So as Philippa mentioned, I've got a day job as Chief Responsibility Officer at Tourism Holdings Ltd, and THL is the largest RV, camper van company in the world, I'd say, in terms of renting and selling. We also manufacture and we run a tourism operation in New Zealand. And if the borders ever open, you are more than welcome to come and check out the Waitomo caves with their glowworms. And we work a lot with the local hapu, the Māori family that area. I also am co-founder of Project Moonshot, and Philippa gave you a little bit of an introduction about it, but I'm going to talk mostly about my work at Moonshot, and I'm going to start off in a really basic way. So I do apologize. I know that many of you here have got significant expertise in sustainability, but I find it helpful to establish a bit of a common understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about sustainability. So again, I have got a quote from the fantastic Kate Raworth about our greatest challenge, meeting the needs of all within the means of the planet. And so this is the kind of basic stuff I was talking about. Many of you will be aware that when people have talked about sustainability to date, they've traditionally thought of these three pillars, economic, social, and environmental, with sustainability being the nexus in between. And of course, the economy has been prioritized. And frankly, I was reflecting on this. I was just up at COP26, and I thought, if Greta Thunberg is my client, I feel that I've failed. I feel that sustainability as we have known it is broken. It's been all about incremental change, and I've really acknowledged my responsibility in that, and the kind of acceptance of a kind of like trying to bring people on the journey. And really, what we need now is a radical transformation of society and our economy, as we've just heard. And when we talk about sustainability, context is absolutely key. Some of you may have seen a version of this cartoon, and it's really interesting for me because it sucks to be right when you're working in sustainability. To my friends who used to call me a tree hugging hippie. I'm looking at kind of I laugh, but everyone is a bit horrified by climate change, and I don't think the penny has necessarily started to drop about the implications of biodiversity collapse. So in my view, we are living through a massive disruption, but it is just the start of what we've got, and resilience, as we've just heard, is going to be absolutely key to our survival. Now, this is an image you may have seen, and from Will Steffen and Johan Rockström, and it's looking at, it basically shows how the Earth was on quite a stable trajectory, and now we're at this point where we've got a choice. And we can either carry on going as we're going, and as we have seen, there's various conjectures about the kind of climate that that we're going to be living in if we do meet the current COP26 targets. And if we carry on in that way, we will be crossing various planetary boundaries. In fact, we have crossed 4 out of 9 already. And we'll be heading to this hothouse Earth scenario where there will be these horrific feedback loops, and the Earth will just get hotter and hotter. Or we can, mobilize and in this next decade, put in a huge concerted effort to actually push this planet back up into another stabilized system, where you can see it's from this diagram, it actually won't take much to push it down into a hothouse Earth again. So it's going to take a lot of effort for us to kind of stabilize, and that's obviously what we're going to need to do. So when I talk about context, when I moved to New Zealand 5 years ago, in my view, a smart move, moving from the UK, I was chair of something called the Circular Economy Accelerator, chair of the advisory board. And I couldn't understand why this concept of a circular economy, so designing out waste and pollution, keeping materials and products in use, and regenerating natural systems, couldn't understand why that wasn't taking off like it had done in Europe. And I've thought about it a lot, and I thought, gosh, there is no local context, right? This, in Aotearoa, something I've observed is that we get these, experts flying in from Europe and sometimes the States, talking about this is the new framework that we've got. It's fantastic. And then they fly out again. And it's, I realized that we needed something that was kind of rooted with a local context. And for me, Kate Raworth's donut economic model is globally just a fantastic visual tool to help people understand this context and the relationship between kind of society and our ecological boundaries. And I'm sure you'll be very familiar with this. And so you'll likely know that the social foundation, those kind of social elements in the middle, are related to the social goals of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And outside, we've got the 9 planetary boundaries. And as I mentioned, we've already overshot on 4 of those environmental boundaries there. And so what I thought was, look, it would be fantastic if we use the donut to contextualize a circular economy, because, for me, the circular economy enables that green space, that safe and just space for humanity in the middle. But I realized that, as a newcomer to Aotearoa, New Zealand, what I needed to do was to make sure that any frameworks and so on that I was, talking about, that they had to be led by the Indigenous people. And so I worked with a Māori scientist called Taina Boasadine, and I asked Taina if she would translate the donut into Te Reo Māori, which she did. And so I'll talk about that in a second. But for those of you who are interested in kind of looking into this from a city's perspective, Leeds University's got a fantastic website, which actually it compares countries at the moment, and it is getting more granular. But essentially, if you can see here, this is the New Zealand donut, if you like, on the left. And you can see how, although New Zealand really likes to think of itself as their kind of clean and green country, 100% pure is a tagline. We've already overshot in a number of number of areas. And what I really like about this model is that you can apply metrics to it. And there is work being done in New Zealand now, as I mentioned, to look at not just cities, but at a community level and specific projects. But it's very helpful to kind of be able to compare the per capita impacts of in different countries. And it's also been applied to, so the donut economics has been applied to a number of cities, kicking off with Amsterdam. And what I really liked about it was that it's not just talking about, how do we survive with disruption, but it's talking about how do we thrive in that context. And one of the key concepts about it is something that we've heard about in the previous talk, which is kind of systems thinking. And I think this is going to be an absolutely critical tool as we go forward in our, whatever field you're in. I think understanding systems thinking, as well as being able to set that context, is really critical. And there's a kind of evolution of thinking in terms of value, right? So before business, I say before, kind of, I don't know, about 20 odd years ago, business was considered very separate from the environment and society. And all of the impacts were externalized. And then there was this idea of shared value, which is kind of the model that I suppose I've kind of been implementing into businesses for the last, 15 plus years. And you'll recognize the similarity with this and the original kind of description of sustainability slide that I had earlier. So this is an example I use here is that you might get a tobacco company. And for example, like Philip Morris, they're really great environmentally. They've got every certification and ISO standard and so on, but their core product still kills people. And so, there's this, you are able to exist in that duality. Your businesses are able to continue doing the wrong thing, but doing a little bit of kind of good stuff on the fringes. And where we're moving to is this idea of system value, where we understand that business and society, our economy is a social construct, and therefore we can redesign it. But we are completely part of a nested system, and we're part of the environment in which we live, and we ignore that at our peril. So this model is from a benchmark that we use at Tourism Holdings, which is called the Future Fit Business Benchmark, and I highly recommend it. It's free to use, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a bit. But it's one of the tools that is the only framework that I found that takes businesses on a journey to firstly becoming sustainable and then ultimately regenerative. And so I'll go back to the donut in a second, but what I really want to talk about is, this kind of diversity and stakeholder engagement and stuff. I think we're kind of moving beyond, having diversity as this kind of bolt-on thing. Oh, we must think about diversity and inclusion. And actually, for me, we really do need to co-create solutions with those communities that we want to help, and make space for that leadership. So kind of back to the donut, and how we were using in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Well, when I worked with Tēnā Puasadine to translate the donut into Te Reo Māori, we translated it and in fact had it designed up by a designer of Pacific Island descent, so that the kind of there was a lot of integrity in the production of this. But something I found really powerful is that even in just the translation of ecological sealing, that became hatomatangi, which is our last breath. And it is so powerful and evocative, right? It doesn't become a planetary boundary or ecological ceiling. It is literally the planet's last breath. And even that for me was, it's really powerful and shows the value, certainly for me, of kind of other perspectives. And but Tēnā kind of went one step further, and she said, actually, Juhi, having a social foundation, an ecological boundary, that's not really the Māori worldview. And she said, what is, the Māori worldview is actually the environment is our foundation. And they have a word, whakapapa, some of you may be familiar, coming from Oceania, which is your ancestry, right? And so in terms of the creation story of Māori people, they're very much descended from, Rangi and Papa, the Earth Mother and the Sky Father, and that creation story is what is denoted in this spiral that you see here, which is called the takarangi, the grey and white spiral in which this kind of donut sits. And I was quite confronted by the fact that, that Tēnā had flipped this donut essentially and put the environment in the middle and the society on the outside. And I thought, how are we going to compare it with Kate's model? And what I realized is, it's not my worldview, but there is such power in having these two models side by side, right? So we're actually trying to get to the same place, but we are coming from different perspectives. And we talked a lot about kind of when you have two models side by side, a kind of indigenous versus a Pākehā Western view, you're kind of creating, as you look through a binocular, you create this kind of one shared vision, that third vision of where you're headed to in the future. And something else I found was a really deep learning for me was that, these design icons that you see, kind of, as I mentioned, this double spiral, but also the kind of the triangles of this ecological foundation and so on, kind of looks like an ethnic pattern, right? And you're like, oh yeah, so it looks ethnic, looks Māori. What I learned was that every single design element is chosen to communicate something. So these triangles in that ecological foundation that we've got here mimic the triangles in the whare, the kind of Māori meeting houses. And as I discussed, that Rangi and Papa, this double spiral, this takarangi, really denotes a dynamic element to this, that it is not like a static place. And whereas the donut, you can map metrics to it and you can look back and say, this is how we have done. This is also taking us into the future because there is a dynamic element to that cycle. And so it's been a fantastic learning experience for me. having this kind of indigenous perspective. So there was a series of essays written by a journalist in New Zealand called Simon Wilson on entitled "Why I'm Afraid," and this was the last essay that he wrote, and he actually called this a reason to hope. And I think that's really important for us to understand, is that basically this idea of, whatever you call it, donut economics, or, looking at a kind of intergenerational wellness or well-being, these are positive visions of the future. We desperately need that in this time where it's so easy to become overwhelmed. And look, there's many, many frameworks and tools. For those of you who aren't familiar with donut economics, there's a Donut Economics Action Lab platform. And, it talks about these different principles, which I find really helpful in applying to any project. And of course, there are many different schools of thought or frameworks that you can use to help make that shift from sustainable to regenerative. But I did mention the Future Fit Business Benchmark, and I would encourage you to check it out, because it sets out, basically it takes a science-based approach and absolutely encourages systems thinking. And they have 23 break-even goals, they're called, to get to a point where a business is sustainable, quote unquote, and then 24 goals which are called positive pursuits, to take you from sustainable into becoming regenerative. And this is a really key concept. And you may have seen various versions of this diagram. Basically, where we currently are is in that kind of the bottom of the red spiral. And what we're trying to do, business has been trying to get to this point of like sustainable, where we're not doing any more damage. Well, we actually need to restore the planet and help create thriving communities. And so we do need to move to kind of what is a regenerative system, which I think is a lot more inspiring than just kind of getting to zero. Zero is a great place to be. We want to actually help to restore and regenerate our planet. So something that we have done at Project Moonshot is all our place-based initiatives are called Moonshot City. And it's not really about kind of cities per se, but about communities, cities and regions. So it's taking a place-based approach. And what we have done is we've actually mapped 100 plus projects across Aotearoa, which are circular or regenerative, because what we really want to do is we want to show all of the fantastic stuff that's happening at a grassroots level already. So we've kind of tagged them by industry type. But what we also have is these tags here, which is looking at, either projects to do with place-based innovation. Regenerative is a tag that we're only giving to the absolute gold standard projects that are genuinely doing systems thinking, using renewable energy, supporting communities and enabling them to thrive and so on. And then we've got these other tags which the Ellen MacArthur Foundation uses. And of course, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is a key organization in the promotion of the circular economy. Because we just were thinking, look, it's quite a nascent concept in New Zealand, and we want to try and maintain some kind of integrity about what you mean by circular. Are you exchanging a plastic for a biomaterial? Are you creating a closed loop system through product stewardship? Are you part of a sharing economy? Are you a networked kind of like hub type organization, which is really distributive? So we have got a bit of an academic lens. This is not, we don't expect for, everyone on the street to kind of forget this, but we're trying to have a bit of a discussion about what types of circular projects and businesses are there. And so would really love any kind of feedback that you have as this particular community. I think would be really valuable for us. We've just heard that we're actually going to get some funding to get a researcher to basically fill in the gaps, because it's very beta. We have been doing this in our own time with our fantastic Moonshot activators, who have been kind of putting in their time and effort, because they're really curious to see what are the systems insights that we're going to get out of it, not just from an industry perspective, but also from a place-based community perspective. What are we going to be able to tell from the initiatives that are there? Are there, for example, in South Auckland, there's a lot of Māori and Pacific Island population, lower income. There's a lot of kind of food-based organizations. Are they talking to each other, using composting facilities? What do we need to close loops, etc.? So we're just at the start of this journey. Would love to get your input, and I will finish on that note.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Juhi. And wonderful to get that overview of the Maori donut, and also to learn more about your project. And I know that Sophie's posted the link as well to the Moonshot map in the chat. So I encourage everyone to check it out, because it's a wonderful, wonderful initiative. Moving speedily along, we've got our third speaker now, Chris Ostrich. Chris is a writer and publisher and a lecturer at Thammasat University's School of Global Studies in Bangkok, where he teaches active learning courses related to sustainability, social innovation, social enterprise, and advocacy. He is the founder of the Wicked Problems Collaborative, an independent press focused on humanity's biggest challenges, and co-founder of the Circular Design Lab, an open innovation platform that focuses on prototyping and delivering solutions for systems change. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Philippa. And my apologies to everyone. I didn't expect to this week, but I've traveled halfway around the world and I'm a little bit jet lagged. I'll try not to let that affect my what I share here. We've had two speakers share a lot of really great stuff, and a lot of what I'm planning to talk about is related. So I'll try to go through some of this quickly. I typically work around resources. So when I'm looking at how we can be regenerative and how we can be better stewards for future generations, I tend to look at resource use. And Kate Raworth's at Economics is a perfect model for us. Not a perfect model, but an excellent model for us to use.
I'll just tell this. Only 2 minutes because I've got to go on Q&A. Rama, the Asia House got back to me. I'm very excited. The press section have got back to me. They are interested.
All right. So as I was saying, the Raworth's model is great for what we're talking about. Wanted to point out something. When we're talking about Raworth's model, we're talking about how are we delivering on basic needs for human beings. That's the only species that we're being concerned with that model. It's very important, and we're obviously doing a very, very poor job of that. But we're not thinking about all of the other species on the planet. So there's something beyond that, massively beyond what are we coming up short on for humanity? What are we taking away from all the other species and keeping them from being able to do? And as well as what are we doing today that is limiting future opportunities for human beings that are yet to be born? So just to compound the shortcomings that we have today and the problems that we're creating. So I think we're on a highly unsustainable path, and we're seeing more of the problems that are being created by the things that we've done. In Canada this past week, after they had all of the problems with fires this summer, now they're having horrible flooding, really problematic. That's beyond anything I think they've dealt with there. And I think we're at a point where people are starting to recognize the need for a paradigm shift. And I think what we've got to do is figure out how can we have that paradigm shift and change the way we live and the ways we interact with each other and with the planet. How can we do that in a way that we have control over it and do it in a managed way that is beneficial for all of us, rather than something that happens to us and that we're just adjusting to all of the problems and trying to minimize the harms that are coming at us. Few ideas that I think might be helpful going forward in thinking about that. One comes from Professor Russell Ackoff, who was a great systems thinker and teacher in that area. He says to ignore constraints when you're designing for systems change. So start with get rid of all the constraints and just think about what would be the perfect or ideal solution to the system problem that you have. How would you like that to be in the future? And then start thinking about, once you've designed that ideal, then start thinking about, okay, well, what are my constraints? How do those impact this ideal? And how can I react to those or redesign, given those constraints? And what is my best possible solution I can come with given the reality, rather than what he believed was, if you start with the constraints in mind, you limit your thinking and you're much less likely to come up with something that's, with the possibilities that are available to you. So I just wanted to share that thought. One of the ideas that I think is really important for people to consider, which I think is gaining a lot of traction, and it's also getting a lot of people fighting fiercely against it, which I think is a good sign of the fact that the traction is really picking up, is the idea of degrowth. The idea that we're doing far too much with our economies. Our planet can't sustain what we're doing. So we need to figure out, how do we go from where we are to something that's manageable, that the planet can withstand, so that you look at that donut economics and all of those red things that are on the outside of the donut go away. How do we get there in a way that takes care of people, and that we, as we're doing that, shift to where those red things on the inside, where we're not taking care of people, also go away. So that's like, our ideal is 10, 20 years from now, we get to a point where both of those things are solved. How can we do that with the current economy that we have? I don't believe that we can. So what is it that we have to do to get there from here? And I think more and more people are recognizing the need for these kind of these massive shifts in the way we live and the way we interact. And it's just a matter of figuring out how to what do we want to do and how do we get there? And then we're going to have some really significant change that I think most people probably at this point don't see as being possible, but they're necessary. So we just have to figure out how to make that shift. Part of what I see as being important with that shift with degrowth is we need to work much less. We have a 40-hour work week that has been standard for decades. If you look back over the last few centuries, the standard work week was at one point, I think, over 70 hours. And it slowly trickled down over the years. But when we got down to a 40-hour work week, we stopped. And if you look at productivity, along the same time that the work week was becoming shorter and productivity went up, the productivity has continued to go up, and it's gone up too much, obviously. But we haven't made the shift in the work week. So I think we need to rethink that and figure out, how do we work an appropriate amount? And even if we have less things and less money coming our way, if we went to a 2 or 3 day work week and we freed up time to do more things with the people that we love and our communities, and that, can we have a better life with less stuff in the future? Because I think that's part of what's going to be necessary. Another idea that I think is potentially important for us is maybe the idea of basic incomes. I think if we position those as just distribution of shared resources, that those could potentially be an idea that can really help us with what we need to do. Because I think, there will probably be in the future a lot less people working. We'll probably have a lot of people subsisting on basic means, and maybe they'll work a little, but I think we'll have a lot less full-time workers going forward if we're going to have the reduction in resource use that we need. And so trying to figure out how to make that work and how to make that normal and not problematic is all important. And I think we need to think a lot about intergenerational representation, which has already been brought up. The group that I co-founded, the Circular Design Lab, we teach systemic design to community members who want to work on local challenges. So systemic design is just a mix of systems thinking and design thinking, where you're looking at the problems and really trying to understand the forces that are creating the undesired outcomes in a system, and looking for ways to adjust those systems and come out with a more desired outcome. In our workshops, part of what we do when we're trying to understand the problem well is we have people take on the roles of different stakeholders, and we're digging into the problem. And when you're in the role of a stakeholder, you're doing some research and coming back, and you do some role playing, and you're really trying to help each other get a shared understanding of the challenge and why things are the way they are. After we do that, we come back and we have a future representation. So part of stakeholders is not just the different stakeholders in a community, but it's also the environment and the wildlife and whatever it is. So we have very, very broad stakeholders. And then when we're looking at it in the second round, it's people are coming in and saying, okay, now I'm the person 100 years from now, I'm the person 1,000 years from now, and there's a lot of guesswork involved in those concerns. But we're forcing people to take a step back and think about them and try to say, okay, if I'm that person who's not going to be born for another 100 years, what would I tell you if I could today? I'd probably scream at you and say, what are you doing to the planet? But, we're trying to put people in that position, and that we don't, it's not natural for us to do it. So we try to put people in that position and make them think about what are we doing to the planet, and how should we be changing the way we do it? So I think that's enough for the intro. But one just last thought I think that's really helpful is the Native American idea of 7 generations. When you're thinking about representation, if we're thinking about 10,000 years from now, it's probably hard for us to grasp it. But if we think about the grandchildren of our grandchildren's grandchildren, that's something I think that's just within our ability to really think about it as, okay, those are people that matter to me, and they're semi-real. It's not so far off. How can we leave the planet in good shape for them, I think is a reasonable thing to try to aim for. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Philippa.
Thank you so much, Chris. And coincidentally, our next event is actually going to take a deep dive into deep time thinking, where we do attempt to bridge that gap into looking at the kind of far future and also the far past. So I'll do a shout out to that at the end. Some really interesting points that you mentioned, Chris, and that I'm really keen to pick up on. Thank you so much for that. So we're going to go into the Q&A now with our speakers. To get us started, though, I just want to pick up on one of the points that I think everybody touched on, which is around this idea of the economy as having this narrative grip over our lives, and shaping the way we think, the way we feel, the way we organize our societies at the micro and the macro level, and also the way we think about ourselves and structure our own lives, personally and particularly our work lives. So I just wanted to ask the panel their thoughts about how we can break out of this dominant narrative, which is so controlling us. I mean, we have frameworks, we have these principles in place, but I feel that what we need is more of this grand scale narrative shift to get people to start enacting the frameworks that we then will then set us on the right path. So I might start with Juhi, because Juhi's nodding next to me.
Thanks, Philippa. Look, my first career was in film, and I used to produce terrible Eurotrash music videos when I lived in New York. Had a great time, but the reason I mention that is because I think there is a critical role for art and culture. I think that there's been a lot of discussion, that around in the policy space and the business space. Well, maybe not enough, but there absolutely has been. But what we really need is to create this compelling vision for the future that it is possible, right, to live differently. So, and quite often what we've seen is a lot of kind of dystopian, books and movies like The Road, for example, and it would be fantastic to to start putting out some, and actually engage with those creative communities to start creating that other vision is one thing I would say. And the other thing is that I think that there is even you can see it in kind of like new microcurrencies and stuff that is going. There is a lot happening at a grassroots level. It's just that it's not necessarily visible, right? And I think that's one of the things we're trying to do with Moonshot is actually say that quite a lot of, when you look at the what's happening on the ground with communities, there's quite a lot of activity happening that is not necessarily reported, right? So yeah, I think I've noticed that we're not the only mapping that's going on, and I know that I think it's a Songlines, is it in Australia? That's that fantastic project. So yeah, so I would suggest those two things.
Thanks, Juhi. Chris, did you want to jump in?
I'm struggling to remember what I was going to say. I think there are a lot of what I'm trying to do is get people to see the need. So I do a lot of public speaking, I'm teaching workshops, and try to help people see that we can't go on like this. There was that leaked IPCC report this summer where it said that humans can't go on if we have a drastic climate shift. Human civilization is done. And trying to get those messages out to people and help them think through what's important and what do they want and what are they willing to give up and what are they willing to do, and trying to basically create an army of the willing that's going to fight for a better future than the one we're headed for.
Brilliant. Girol, did you want to weigh in?
You cannot break out of this paradigm and narrative when more than half of the world's population are starving. They need to eat. They need to put a roof over their head. And that's why, if you think systemically, the starting point is poverty. And if you can address that and get people to lift their heads, then you can start thinking about environment. Poverty is the greatest enemy of the environment. And you can start talking about social cohesion and other matters. So for people like ourselves who are living in our comfortable homes and can eat and take a shower every day and all that, to talk about changing the story is not going to work. You have to just tell a story to the people at large and convince them that unless we do something about it, we fund it and we change it, it's not going to happen. So you need to, that's why carrying everyone and leaving no one behind is a critical starting point of the intervention.
A really good point. Thank you so much, Girol. Just picking up on a couple of other questions, actually. One of them, which I'm quite interested in as well, which is quite controversial, is around this notion of population control. So we've touched on it a few times. Is this, and this is Nick's question. So he says, is any of what we're talking about today possible without reducing the human population? And he's quite right. This is a big taboo, but I'm keen to tackle it. And I think this panel is the right panel to do it. So, I'll let, maybe, Girol, did you want to jump in first?
Population growth, whether you come to it from a purely economic perspective, as Sir Partha Dasgupta did in his biodiversity report, or from any other perspective, is the main pressure point on the natural environment. And however, that's of course a politically sensitive point. And when one makes that point, it raises a lot of emotions. Again, what we find is that the more educated people, the people who have a higher standard of living, actually do their own population control. Fertility rates in all the materially well world is actually declined below the rate of increase of population. So again, if you deal with poverty and lift this material standard of living of people, then all of a sudden you will realize that it will solve itself. Education plus that together will do it. So we don't have to tell people not to have babies or anything else. It has its own dynamic. But the reality is population growth is a huge pressure on the natural environment. And as we find around the world, through migration flows and other, on social cohesion as well. And because of that, it creates political tensions. There's no doubt about that.
Thank you, Girol. Chris, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I guess I look at that just a little differently. Factually, I agreed. My perspective on that is the people who have fewer children use far, far more resources to the point that it's beyond what's reasonable. I think if you were able to quantify a reasonable amount of resource use for the planet for a year, and you spread it out across all of the humans, the more humans you have, the less each would get, right? You have less humans, everyone would have more. What we need to figure out is how to be more equitable with the resource use while reducing the resource use within the planetary limits. And what the painful thing here, that this is where people start getting upset and don't want to have this conversation, is basically what I'm arguing is that people who are in the upper quartile of incomes are going to have significantly less going forward if we're going to do this in a just way. And that's a really hard conversation to have.
Juhi,
Firstly, I'd like to echo, I think that education is key. For me, particularly women, giving women access to education and the, ability to earn income has a dramatic effect, I think, on birth rates and so on. But I cannot. I'm really struggling with the 1%ers at the moment. I'm really struggling where we came out of COP26 and there was kind of, without irony, a piece in kind of one of the national newspapers in the UK about what of the 1%, what are they spending their money on out of lockdown? And a whole article about how they just decided that money is for now, and so they're going to get the super yacht, and they're going to do this, and because they've been in lockdown, and it just blows your mind that these people. First of all, I mean, there's a whole tax issue, which I think somebody's mentioned in the chat. We're not even taxing our biggest corporations, okay, is a reality. But the fact that this kind of conspicuous consumption, or just they don't particularly care, but this, it's so extraordinary that this is in the same newspaper as basically, our biggest existential crisis. And so, I'm not quite sure how that relates to population control, but I thought I'd have a rant about it, and actually what's acceptable. Because, I mean, to Chris's point, we just absolutely are going to have to look at resources as well.
Sure. Let's have a chat about tax as well, because as you mentioned, it is an important point, and I'm keen to hear the thoughts of others around this, around whether what we need is different taxation systems and different regulatory mechanisms to make our economy more equitable. Girol, did you want to jump in first?
Yeah. There is absolutely no doubt, if you think of equity, especially intergenerational equity, then and if you worry about the unintended consequences of taxes, the most effective, efficient, and equitable intergenerationally tax is to tax land, undeveloped land in particular, and property, use this as a resource for long-term investment, and use that as a basis to invest in young people. After all, we do this for our old people. We look after the 65 plus, at least in New Zealand. We invest and feed them, and we give them universal basic income for all practical purposes, but we choose not to do that for our young people. There are means of taxation, and the best one is, in the terms of effectiveness, efficiency, equity, is a tax on property, especially on property that you cannot move anywhere else in the world, and use it appropriately. In order to do that, you have to, first of all, tell a coherent narrative to convince people. And secondly, to give confidence to people that that money collected will actually improve the lives of young people. So there's a trust element in government as well.
Chris, did you want to pick up as well on tax?
Sure. I think I believe that the taxes should be on a steep curve. Like an income tax should be on a curve instead of the tiered things, because the tiered things just allows people to game the system. If you have a steep curve, then somebody who has a really high income is going to pay really high taxes. The other thing I think that is really important with taxes that we don't normally do is to have, to set out a certain point in time, say it's every 20 years or 30 years or whatever, that you refresh the system, because we build in so many loopholes over time that people get away with absolute murder with their taxes. And I think just wipe those clean and then rebuild the system so that everyone knows what's going on. People have a chance to have a say, and you don't build these things in where we've got systems that are so highly preferenced towards wealth these days that it's everything is accreting upwards, and it's completely unfair. And I think we really need to deal with that.
Thanks, Chris. Juhi, did you want to add anything further to what you said before about tax?
No, I mean, I just echo the views that have been shared.
There's a lot of questions or comments rather coming through about consumption and our need to buy or our desire to buy services, etc., and goods and services to keep up with the Joneses and this image of production that we all seem to want to fulfill, which is, of course, is something that Chris picked up on. Let's drill down a little bit deeper into that, because I can see a lot of comments saying that, wouldn't it be an amazing thing if politicians actually legislated to reduce consumption and, that we actually took steps to, prevent this horrendous wastage that we're all guilty of, I'm sure, in the West. So I just wanted to see if anyone had any comments around that. Perhaps, Chris, we can start with you and you can add to what you were saying earlier.
I guess I typically think about it at the individual level of trying to consume less and do less. And like I've changed in over the last 10 years. I got rid of my car about 10 years ago, take public transit everywhere I can, take a cab when I need to. I started composting my food waste years ago and use that in the garden. We grow produce and things that we eat and give away to neighbors and that. Trying to buy less, thinking a lot more about, is this necessary? Do I need this? Or is this just a impulse? I want this type of thing. Definitely, I think it would be great to have policy around that to try to encourage us to do more of those things. I think, business has, especially big business, has a hold on our governments that it would make it very, very hard in the current circumstances. So figuring out how to get those sorts of changes through, I think the same kind of groundswell I discussed earlier is going to be necessary, because otherwise I just don't think, at least, in the US context, I don't see it having any hope.
It reminds me of that acorn brain and the marshmallow brain that Roman Krasnarek brought out at the very start of our conversation 6 events ago, where he basically said that wouldn't it be lovely to have a buy in a year button, so that we could kind of short circuit that desire to have that immediate satisfaction. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. Juhi, did you want to say anything about it?
Yes. Yeah, I absolutely. I've worked a lot with clients in fashion, and particularly looking at kind of this issue of fast fashion and consumption and this phenomenon that we've seen of young women in particular on YouTube demonstrating their hauls. So they'll go out and they'll spend $50 and they'll have 2 sackfuls of clothes and they'll hold them up and just say, oh yeah, I don't know if I'm going to bother wearing this. And, there's this whole culture that has, but this is, a result of decades of marketing and advertising. And I do think Look, it's not being naive about kind of let's just tell stories, right? But stories are really compelling, and I feel that we need to engage every single industry, as well as policy. Yes, if we can legislate for it. I just feel there's so much short-termism in politics. So I love this idea of a kind of like a separate intergenerational thinking, long-term thinking organization. But if we could engage, for example, the marketing and advertising agencies and say to them, okay, of, all of the, a certain percentage, 10, 20% of all the ads you make have to, be on these particular topics. So maybe it's around climate, maybe it's around consumption, and it might seem counterintuitive, but a lot of these guys want to do the right thing, but they are in the system where their clients are trying to sell more stuff, right? That's one thing. And also, I think that from a legislative perspective, the Takarangi work that we were doing is considered a kind of values-based compass that has been used to inform the new national waste strategy in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and was led by a Māori group. And there was a real struggle in setting up this kind of the draft that is out for public consultation, in that there's a real sense that people were just kind of like insisting on continuing to think about waste, and just absolutely wedded to kind of like, how do we recycle and without thinking about the top of the waste hierarchy and the prevention in the first place. And it's such a mindset shift, and it was a real struggle. But I think that people are trying to get there to that point of actually going, let's think about circular business models and leasing and so on. But legislation needs to enable that to happen, rather than just thinking about building more waste infrastructure and enabling landfill and so on. So, yeah.
Really good point. Thanks, Juhi. Girol, did you want to add any comments to that?
The growth of consumption, as well as the composition of consumption, are the 2 points, in addition to population growth, that were highlighted as the main pressure points for the biosphere and environment. So that's a given. The intervention, whether you do it to regulation and all that, we know that kind of thing creates monsters, and various unintended consequences. What we need to do is to do what Chris is doing. If we have more Chris's, educated people who buy into the story, understand the dynamics, then they naturally adopt their lifestyle. So they shift from cars to walking. They go from 2 cars to 1. They go from 1 car to electric vehicles if they can afford it. So if you can actually even out the inequality and educate people, just like with population control, it will happen. The only question is whether we have the luxury of time to let it happen slowly. And that's where the boundary crossing is extremely concerning. But there is no doubt that consumption growth and the composition of it have to be addressed. Yes.
Such a really, really good point. And there's so much we could talk about. I'd love to keep you all for another hour, but I know it's really late for Girol, and I know that Chris is suffering from really severe jet lag. So I have just one last question for our panel, if you'll let me, which comes from Shan, which is basically around what do we need to do to sustain well-being for the long term, so long term, for all eternity, if you want to put it that way. And if you can just send us away with some final thoughts around that would be a really valuable end to the conversation. So I'll start with you, Girol, if that's okay.
Well, I live in this village where we agonize about this all the time. What kind of institutions do you generate that actually play a stewardship role, and to make sure that we lift our heads from the day-to-day issues to genuinely long-term issues? So because I have been brainwashed by economics, my mind goes to institutions, and the kind of institutions that other societies have created, such as Wales and other places, that deliberately and exclusively focus the mind and hold the mirror on intergenerational issues, is absent in our country. And I'm very encouraged to find that a lot of countries are doing that. And when they do, it actually makes a difference. For example, in Wales, the Intergenerational Commission or whatever commission for the future, they have a system where any big investment has to run through the screen of saying, okay, to Chris's point earlier, you want better transport, faster transport, but there are 20 ways of doing it. Why don't we pick the one that will give you the transport? We don't want you to compromise your lifestyle, but we'll do it in a way that has no damage to the environment. If you create that environment, then all of a sudden you're in a different world. But first you have to get the story to be accepted. In my village, the story has not been accepted yet.
Amazing. Thank you. Juhi, did you want to go next?
Yes, that's a massive question. And I think for me, what I've learned is that we need to have these people at the table when we're making decisions. So rather than just kind of on behalf of that, we need to have young people as part of the decision-making process, even at board level. And, I saw there's so much activity around COP26, and these kids are really passionate, but their voices were not reflected in what happened inside, and so I feel very strongly that they need to be at the table. And I absolutely support this idea of having some kind of screen or organization or institution that is kind of committed to long-term thinking, because the political cycle is simply too short.
Great. And Chris, your turn.
I guess I've kind of talked about the different things that I do. There's a limit to what any individual can do. Unless you're in a seat of power, you're not going to go and sign off legislation that's going to have a massive change. But what I try to do is through my teaching, through the workshops, through my social enterprise, is to try to touch people in a way that helps them look at things differently. And hopefully they start making different choices. They start doing things differently. And they're also sharing these stories and getting other people to look at things differently. So I guess I kind of look at it as, I think the old board game was called Othello, where you're trying to flip all the tiles to one color. And what I'm trying to do is spread this worldview around to lots of people, and hopefully they're doing the same, so that we get that groundswell that is, I think it's coming. I see more and more, especially youth that are just furious with the state of the world, and they want change. And I think we just have to keep building that mass of people that are saying enough. We've got to do something differently.
Amazing. Thank you, Chris. And thank you so much to all of our speakers. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. But thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you especially to our wonderful panel, Juhi, Chris, and Girol. It's been an incredible conversation, and I'm sure everyone will go away with their minds full of things to explore, to think about, and particularly do explore the work of our speakers. All of them are working on really interesting projects, initiatives. So please do check out the resources we've shared in the chat. And of course, if you liked this event, please register for the next event in the series, which will be our second last event, which will be called Deep Time Dreamers on the 2nd of December. And like I mentioned before, we'll be exploring the sublime and awe-inspiring concept of deep time, which I'm really looking forward to. And Sophie's posted a link to that in the chat as well. And you can also catch up on our previous events, of course, on our YouTube channel. And this one will be joining those as well shortly. So thank you again, everybody. And I hope you all have wonderful days. And now I'll just invite everyone to unmute so we can say goodbye. So thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.